Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be giving an introduction to notifications in React Native and also show you how setup with push notifications can be done really easily with Expo. So first off, introductions. My name is Charlie Cruzan, like Ben said. I work at Expo, where we make it really easy to build awesome React Native apps. So Expo does this by providing a layer on top of React Native. For anyone that's not already familiar with Expo, this layer basically just has a whole bunch of tools and services for your React Native app. I think the one that most people tend to be familiar with is our open source SDK, which has like a ton of libraries for the device camera or notifications, authentication, things like that. We have about 70 libraries total, so it's actually a really large piece of surface area. But we also have tools for development like the CLI and Expo Go and the new dev client app, which is like a custom Expo Go. It's in preview right now, but a pretty exciting feature. And then finally launching in the next couple of weeks is EAS, or Expo Application Services, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Cool. So enough introductions. What are notifications? I'm sure everyone here has received a notification before, of course, but at their simplest, it's a pop-up message that appears on a user's device. These are really useful for things like alerting your users about certain events or driving up engagement, like when an app sends you those messages that are like, hey, haven't seen you in a while, check this feature out. And then also crafting really smooth user experiences. So for instance, if I get a notification to verify my email, by tapping that notification, I should go straight to the screen where I do that thing, verify my email. But notifications are a double-edged sword. So they can be as annoying as they are useful. So you want to be smart in how and when you use them. So for instance, no one likes getting too many notifications or needless notifications, like you can see right there in the screen. And then notifications like late at night or early in the morning also are kind of proven to not be really enjoyable. So both of these are really surefire ways to have users either revoke your notification permissions or worse, uninstall the app completely. So you want to be really smart in the way that you use notifications. Cool. So when we're talking about notifications, there's actually two different types, push notifications and local notifications. So push notifications are initiated off of the device from some server, and then local notifications are exactly what they sound like, scheduled locally inside of your app without any kind of external request being made. And as you can see, both look completely identical to the user, function the same to the user. The one on the top is triggered from a server somewhere, so like an external request. And then the one on the bottom is triggered by making a simple function call in our app to the Expo notifications library. In this case, it's the schedule notification async method. Yeah, so if they both look the same and they both function the same, then when should I use a push notification versus a local one? It's actually pretty easy to kind of break this down. Local notifications are generally much easier and faster to set up, but come with a little bit less flexibility. So for instance, like with local notifications, you need to know ahead of time when the notification comes up. Good use cases for this would be anything schedulable, like deadlines or reminders in an app are really good for local notifications. Push notifications, on the other hand, can be initiated and sent whenever, since it's happening on the server side. So this is really good for a chat message is sent and I want to let my user know that they have received a chat message. I would use a push notification to alert them about that. But cons to push notifications are they take more setup. You know, you have to run a server and pay for that server. And then generally they're just like a little bit more finicky because of the credentials and setup that's required. But for our purposes today, we're going to be talking about push notifications specifically, just because they're a little bit more exciting. For local notifications, you can visit the Expo docs and it's pretty simple to get started. Cool. So for push notifications in a React Native app, these are all the steps we kind of have to do for setup. It's not crazy, but it does seem like there's a decent amount of duplicated work here for iOS and Android. But luckily, if we use Expo, we can get rid of basically half this work. And now we're left with three pretty simple steps. So getting the token, making a request for a notification to be sent, and then handling that notification in our app code. Once again, Expo makes it even easier for us by providing a couple tools that mean we just have less work to do. So two of these tools are the Expo notifications client-side library for all of our in-app code, getting the push token, handling the receival, like setting up listeners, things like that. And then we're going to use Expo's push service to handle all of our server-side work and credentials and all that stuff. All right, cool. So hopping right into it. Getting the token, which the Expo push token is basically just the address where we want to send notifications to. It uniquely identifies an instance of your app on a user's device. And so that's what we're going to be using to send notifications. So let's build this function to collect our token. First of all, we want to make sure that our device can actually receive push notifications. So simulators and emulators can't. They just don't have the capability of receiving push notifications. So if we're not running on a physical device, we're just going to alert and return null. Next, we need to ask the user for permission to send notifications to them. If they don't grant us permission, obviously we should alert and return null. And if they've already granted permissions, this will actually just return granted and not re-ask them again. So that functions really, really smoothly. Okay, now this next piece of highlighted code is a bit of a weird chunk. On Android, there's something called notification channels. And these are basically used to assign particular behavior to notifications like a custom ringtone or a custom vibration pattern. And Expo sets one up by default, but I want to explicitly create one here with the importance set to maximum. Without this, it's possible that when the notification arrives, the Android operating system decides, not really that important of a notification. I'm not going to show the pop-up for it. And we don't want that to happen, so let's just set it to the max to be safe. Cool. And then we just make a call to get Expo push token async, and we have our push token, and it's as easy as that. So with a pretty simple function, like 15 lines of code, we are a third of the way there. Next, let's make our request to Expo and get this notification delivered. So when it comes to sending a request, we have two options: using curl in our terminal or some type of server SDK. Expo has a node server SDK that we maintain, and then the community has actually created a ton based off of that one and a ton of other libraries, depending on whatever you need in your backend. In production, obviously, you'd use a server SDK rather than like manually curling in your terminal every time you want to send a notification. But for our talk, we're just going to use curl because it's a little bit easier to show off. Okay, so when communicating with Expo's push service, you actually communicate in two parts. So the first request is just to actually send the notification, and then we're going to send a follow-up request afterwards to check and make sure our notification was sent successfully. The second request is actually just getting information. It's not doing anything like user-facing, but it's important for us to be aware of any errors that we need to address. Otherwise, we're sending notifications and maybe they never arrive at our device. And it's like, well, how do I debug that? I don't have any error. So it's really important to follow up. Cool. So for our first request, we're just going to be instructing Expo which token to send the notification to, which is our to field, and then a couple fields on what we want in the notification. Here, we're just going to do like a simple hello world notification. And then Expo is going to receive our request and respond telling us whether or not our request was okay. And if it was okay, it'll give us back an ID that we'll use a little bit later on. And it's important to note that just because we received an okay response here, it doesn't actually mean our notification was successful. Because in the background, what Expo is doing is after receiving our request, it sends off a new request to one of two places. Apple Push Notification Service, or APNS for iOS, and then Firebase Cloud Messaging, FCM for Android. And then those native push services will send the actual notification directly to the device, which is the same device specified by our Expo push token in our original request. So that's it. Our notification has hopefully arrived on the device, but we do want to do that follow-up request and make sure that everything went off without a hitch. So we take that ID we received back in our first request and say, hey, Expo, whatever happened with this notification I asked you to send? And Expo is going to be like, oh, yeah, we sent it off to APNS or FCM, and should have arrived at the device, totally fine. And so now we've like done our error checking, made sure it worked, and that's really great. We are now done with our second step. The device has received a notification. We could theoretically stop here if that's all the behavior that we want. But let's say that maybe when a user receives a notification, we want to take some sort of action in the app, or when a user interacts with the notification, like by tapping it, maybe we want to do something there. Like if our user taps a notification, we open a particular screen in the app. So for that first one, handling notifications while our app is in the foreground, it's actually really, really easy. We're going to add a listener that's called the add notification received listener, and provide a callback that will be run whenever a notification comes in. So we can add this listener basically wherever we want in our app lifecycle, but it's usually best practice to add it in the root component, just so that we are assured that it has mounted as early as possible. So if a request comes in for a notification really early on in the app, we've already kind of added this listener and nothing's gonna go wrong, basically. And then also important to note is that our callback, which is the function we're running whenever a notification comes in, will receive the notification itself as an argument. So we can take different behavior depending on content that's in the notification itself. So that's great for handling when a notification comes in and our user has the app open. But what if the app is backgrounded? It would be really nice if we could run some block of code even when the app is in the background. And luckily, using Expo notifications with another library called Expo Task Manager, we can do exactly that. It's a little bit more finicky since, unfortunately, the operating system can actually make its own decision whether or not to wake the app while it's in the background. The most common cause for it not waking the app is like if battery optimization is on. So it's useful to keep that in mind as you're designing user flows and make sure this isn't absolutely necessary that the task is run. Like it's just beneficial to the user, but not vital. Cool. So first off, for background notification handling, we want to define the task that will be run. So this task takes two parameters, an identifier, which is just an arbitrary string, and then the function that we want to run. So here we just have like a dummy function saying fetch some data. One thing that's really important to note is that this function needs to be described in the global scope, so outside of any React Native component. Otherwise, it just won't work the way we want it to. And that's it. Once we have defined our task, we just call notifications.register task async, give the identifier, and anytime a notification comes in while our app is backgrounded, this kind of chunk of code will run, and it's super good for running background fetch requests, for instance. Cool. So finally, let's say our user has interacted with the notification, like by tapping it, and we want to navigate to a certain screen. Since everyone likes React hooks, we're going to use the use last notification response hook here, which is exposed by the notifications library. It functions just like the name suggests, gives you the last notification that our app has received. So some example code, we have our root component here, we'll call our hook, and if the value is not null, we know that the user has tapped or interacted with our notification in some way. And if that's the case, we just use the linking API to navigate directly to a screen, whatever one is defined inside of our notification data, since in each notification, you can kind of add arbitrary like JSON data objects too. Cool. So what if I wanted to handle some even spicier interactions in my app? So for instance, maybe I want my user to respond to a message like directly from the notification pop-up without having to open my app at all. Or maybe I want to give them like a list of options that lets them take some predefined set of actions. This is really easy to add with something called notification categories. But I'm going to leave it as a bonus round for people to read up in the Expo notifications documentation, just because it's a little out of scope. But the good news is that it'll only take like 10 lines of code, so it should be pretty easy for everyone to do. Cool. So we've done all our 3 steps. We've gotten the token, we've sent the request, the notification was sent, and we handled it inside the app code. So our app is ready for production. What happens next? So unfortunately, it's not super uncommon for notifications to work great in development. And then when you ship to production or test in production, it just seems like everything's on fire, meaning your notifications just aren't coming through. But luckily, this is all usually down to the same root cause, which is credentials. Both iOS and Android have their own sets of required push notification credentials. So let's just go through those really, really quick. On iOS, we use something called an APN key or Apple push notification key. Each developer account through Apple is given 2 keys, and you can use these in as many apps as you want. There's no limitation. The good news is that with Expo's build services, if you want, they are completely handled for you. And I usually recommend this flow for basically anyone because it means you don't have to think about your APN credentials at all. And otherwise, you kind of run the risk of accidentally revoking a key if you handle things manually, and that can break push notifications in your app. And I've seen that happen a ton of times already with production apps, and it's pretty stressful and difficult to debug. So Android is a bit different in that it requires a more manual process, which is configuring Firebase or FCM. So it's fairly simple and step-by-step. But if you miss just one step or miscalculate something, then it means notifications won't work. And it's usually a pretty difficult thing to debug. So the best advice I can give is to follow our documentation, be really methodical, and you should be totally fine, hopefully. Cool. So we've gone through basically everything that's necessary when it comes to push notifications in a React Native app and in an Expo app. And just to summarize like my quick pitch for why you should use Expo, Expo basically gives you 3 really useful features. The Expo notifications client library for all your in-app notification code, like getting the push token, setting categories, triggering local notifications, and that kind of stuff. A streamlined notification service, which means very little server setup for you to do. And then finally, credentials management integrated right into the build system because no one likes to think about credentials and permissions. And on the flip side, I also wanted to do a bit of an anti-pitch for Expo's push service, so why you shouldn't use it. For instance, if you've already got like experience working with APNS and FCM directly or some other push service and it's not broken, use that. Why change? Otherwise, if you have a need for a feature that's not available from Expo yet, then obviously in that case, you should also use APNS or FCM. But let us know what that feature is because we're always adding things to Expo's push service, so we'd love to support it soon. The good news is that when you build your app with our new build service called EAS Build or Expo Application Services, you aren't locked into any of Expo's libraries or our push service or anything like that. You're free to use whatever it is that you want. So if that's APNS and FCM, you can do that. We have documentation on it. Or if it's another third-party service like OneSignal, you can do exactly that as well. And then really quick, before I wrap things up, I did want to mention some really exciting news, which is our upcoming release of Expo Application Services. Mentioned it a couple times, EAS for short. This is Expo's kind of brand new suite of cloud services that we're going to be launching pretty soon. And it will be all services that are compatible with any project. So if you're in the Expo managed workflow, the Bear workflow, just a regular React Native project that's never used anything from Expo before, it'll work straight in your app. And the first 2 services that will be available are EAS Build and EAS Submit. So both are pretty self-explanatory. Build lets you build and sign your apps in the cloud and is much more extensible than our last build service in that you can use all the custom native code that you want. And then with Submit, you can send your apps right to the stores right after building and makes just that whole kind of workflow really seamless. So EAS lends itself really well to automation and CI/CD, which we'll be hearing a talk from Cedric on later. So not today though. So basically it all just makes it so you can iterate faster than you could before. And these are all just like the first services to come. EAS will have a whole suite eventually. And then once we officially release over the next couple of days or weeks, EAS will offer a free tier so that way you can try out everything and make sure it works really well for you and your team and your project before you give us a dime. And if you're interested in trying EAS out early, then you should visit expo.dev/EAS and you can sign up for the preview and kind of get a taste of all the features now. And that's it. So thanks everyone for listening. I hope you learned something. And I guess I'm happy to answer any questions right now about notifications or EAS or Expo in general.